Welcome to this episode of The Self-Led Leader. This is week 2 in our The Psychology of series, where every week I'm unpacking the psychology behind some of your biggest and most frequently asked questions. This week we are talking all about imposter syndrome, what it is, and in my perspective, where it comes from, how our psychology, our perspective, our mindset influences it, and why certain things like just be more confident or generic tips online don't seem to fix yours. My hope is that by the end of this episode, you understand exactly what is causing your imposter syndrome and how to overcome it. Let's get right into it. This is The Self-Led Leader. I'm Dr. Christina Ady, and in this show, we explore how your beliefs about who you are and what you're capable of determine the results that you're getting. Every week, we go beyond your skills and strategy to explore the psychology of how you operate and how it's been limiting you so you can finally achieve the goals you didn't think you could. Let's get into today's episode. Imposter syndrome has become a little bit of a hot topic. It's a word that's often thrown around in the leadership or the self-development space and can mean a few different things to different people. But overall, imposter syndrome is typically used to refer to someone who is credible, who has expertise, who on paper has all the qualifications that they need for the position that they're in, but internally, inside, they still feel like they don't belong, like they're not smart enough, like they don't know enough, like they're not an expert enough. And that is usually accompanied by some level of fear, self-doubt, uncertainty, and a lot of inner tension around not being good enough or being found out as not being good enough or as being an imposter at the job that you're in. And I remember the first time that I was really trying to explain the imposter syndrome that I was feeling for someone else, they had a really hard time wrapping their mind around it. You see, I was still in graduate school. I must have been maybe 2 or 3 years into my degree, and I was fueled by self-doubt and imposter syndrome. I technically had the qualifications. I was a graduate student in a graduate program doing my graduate research, checking off all the boxes, attending all the meetings, going to all the conferences, doing the workshops. And yet internally, there was always this sense of fear that I wasn't doing it right, or I wasn't doing it well enough, and that in comparison to other people, that I would be found out as being a worse quality student or a worse quality researcher than they were. And when I first tried to explain this concept to someone outside of the space, they had a really hard time understanding this. And they said, what do you mean? What do you mean you feel like an imposter? You're doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And that's the thing about imposter syndrome when you're on the other side of it, when you're feeling it in your day-to-day life. It doesn't always make sense. And it can feel incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging to actually figure out the path to get out of it and to start to feel like the expert that you know you're supposed to be in the position that you're in. And that's regardless of whether you are an executive, a top leader, or a founder running your own business. It's the inner work that needs to be done because it's not influenced by your external circumstance. Your position could change, but your feelings and your perspective might not. And so, when it comes to understanding the psychology of imposter syndrome, I believe that it comes down to 2 specific things. First is your perspective, and second is the level of doubt that you're feeling. So let's unpack both. When it comes to your perspective, there's so much value in understanding what you are focusing your attention on. Let's use an example for this. Think back to the last time that you went on a road trip, or if you've never been on a road trip, just imagine one. You're in the car, you're driving, and you're about an hour into the road trip. Maybe you still have 3 to 4 hours to go. It's very likely, especially if you're anything like me, that you're driving, looking at your GPS, calculating how much more time it's going to take you to get there, how many kilometers or miles are left in your trip, how fast you're going, whether there's traffic up ahead, and you're so focused on the distance that remains to be traveled. Rather, how often are you on a road trip and you're driving and you're thinking about how far you've already driven? If you're a quarter of the way into the trip, how often are you focused and thinking about the fact that you've already made it a quarter of the way? That's our perspective. You see, When I look up imposter syndrome online, when I try to get a sense of what advice other people are getting and searching for, and just sort of what the narrative is online, so often I see this boil down to the explanation of the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And this is a psychological concept where the idea being when you are new to something, and you first start to learn it, you feel like you are an expert pretty quickly. You feel like you get it and you know it, and your confidence goes up. And yet, the more that you get to know, the more that you realize there is yet even more to learn. And so your confidence actually decreases because you realize how much you don't yet know. And this explanation has never quite sat right with me when it comes to imposter syndrome. It's not satisfying enough because I don't think it fully captures the nuance of what imposter syndrome is. And so let's go back to our road trip example. If I'm about a quarter of the way into my road trip and I recognize that there is still 3/4 to go, I know how much time that will take. Maybe I'm anticipating the fact that there will be traffic, or I'll need to make some stops, or I'm already preemptively anticipating getting to my destination, but being fatigued, tired, with aches and pains from sitting for that long. And so I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is very similar to that in the sense of we are often focused with our perspective on what is yet to come and how much there is still to know. But I don't think that's nuanced enough. Because just as if you were driving, how often are you focused on the fact that you're doing a good job driving, that you're making it in good time and you're driving safely, right? Our perspective is so much more nuanced than just honing in on how much I know versus how much I don't know. And when it comes to your imposter syndrome, it's not just about knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, because that is not what is fueling your doubt. Often it's the nuance of your perspective, and your perspective boils down to your focus on the inside, on the internal versus on the outside, the external. And so if I'm driving and I'm focused on how much further I need to get, whether or not there's traffic along the way, that is a very external focus. I have no control over any of those factors. But if I'm driving and I'm focused on whether or not I'm doing a good job driving, whether I'm driving safely and making better time than I anticipated, that is an internal focus. That is a focus on myself and the factors that I have control over. And so imposter syndrome, from my perspective, is often an over-exaggerated focus on yourself and your perceived lack of skills or abilities or something that you find lacking within yourself that you're insecure about. And the focus is on that rather than on the external. When I was in graduate school dealing with my own imposter syndrome, when I started my business and had imposter syndrome in this domain, one thing that I always found so incredibly useful was to shift my perspective to the external. And a very simple way to do this is to pay attention to the moments that give you the most anxiety and instead focus on what other people are doing to get a sense of where you are in comparison. Now, here's what I mean. I'm not saying to go ahead and just compare yourself and then make yourself feel worse. There's nuance to this. So using me as an example, one of the situations that always triggered my imposter syndrome was our weekly department-wide meetings. There were so many individuals there that I focused on how smart they were and my perceived lack of expertise, that I would doubt my own knowledge, my own credibility, my own thought process. And often I would start to spiral and question whether I understood the presentation, whether I followed the research properly, whether the question that I had was even worth asking. Because if it wasn't, I would just embarrass myself, I would embarrass my supervisor, I would embarrass my lab by default. And so here's what I mean by changing your perspective and focusing on the outward. Rather than sitting in the meetings and thinking about myself and my own self-doubt and my entire focus being on whether or not my question is good enough, I would let that go and I would just notice and pay attention and listen to the types of questions that my peers and my colleagues were asking. And what I started to notice is that other individuals were asking the exact same question that I had, maybe phrased a little bit differently, maybe through their lens or expertise. But I started to notice a pattern that the same thoughts that I was having, they were having too. And so rather than continuing to fuel my self-doubt, Instead, I started to use that as evidence to counteract the doubt I was feeling. Because if they were confident enough to ask their question, and their question was the same as my question, why am I not confident enough to ask my question too? Shifting your perspective when it comes to your psychology is so incredibly powerful, because the exact same situation will start to be interpreted differently. And when you are interpreting it differently and having that different evidence start to accumulate, it changes how you feel and it changes how you think. And as a result, that changes how you act. So your perspective is a massive part of that. So your focus on the inner versus outer is just one part of your perspective. The other part is on your interpretation of the amount of effort versus ease that it will take to accomplish the task. Let's go back to our road trip example. If I'm driving and I know I still have 3/4 of the way to go, and I'm focused on the fact that my back is starting to hurt, my leg is cramping, I want another coffee, but there's not a pit stop for who knows how long. There's traffic up ahead. The person ahead of me is driving too slow and they won't get out of my way. If I'm focused on all the roadblocks and all the difficulty in accomplishing the task, getting to my destination will feel like it takes way more effort. If, on the other hand, I'm focused on the fact that I can listen to my favorite music, maybe I have multiple episodes of my favorite podcasts queued up, my kids are having fun, I have my favorite snack nearby, the entire trip starts to feel a little bit more easy. And so your perspective isn't just about whether you're focused on yourself or on other people. It's also about how much effort you think it will take. And so if we go back to the Dunning-Kruger Effect and you recognize the fact that you don't know what you don't know and what you don't know feels like so much, and you recognize that what you do know took you time and effort and energy to learn, then learning everything that you don't know can start to feel really difficult and really effortful, and you start to anticipate the fact that it will take more effort. And so if you're then focused on yourself and your lack of whatever your perceived lack of quality is, combined with the perception that it will take a lot of effort to fix it, well, now you're stuck in a spiral of what am I going to do and how am I going to get out of this, because I don't have the time or the energy or the money or the effort or whatever else excuse comes up to you to feel like you can even start to overcome it. And so the perspective here is so incredibly nuanced and dual-sided. But in my perspective, it is one of the greatest driving factors of imposter syndrome. So now that we have a sense of our perspective being on inner versus outer, ease versus effort, we can start to recognize how different situations, different behaviors, different tasks can start to fall into one of these 4 quadrants. Something that's internal and feels easy, we feel like we have control over it, we feel good doing it, it feels like a breeze. That's like if I'm driving, listening to my favorite podcast, eating my favorite snack, and having an iced coffee, driving feels like a breeze. If we then look at something being internal but feeling like more effort, we still have a sense of control over it. But that's where imposter syndrome can start to creep in. Because if we feel like it's completely up to us, that's a lot of pressure. And if our perspective is already skewed and biased against ourselves, if we're so used to focusing on the negative or the lack of the thing that we have, that we want to have, the skill that we don't yet have, the expertise that we haven't fully stepped into, whatever else, that can start to feel difficult and like we haven't accomplished it. And that can reinforce and reiterate the negative or the lack perspective that we have. And this is where imposter syndrome can start to live. Now, on the opposite end, if we're focused on the external, and something feels easy, then it can still feel easy to do, but it feels like it's out of our control, which can make it seem like it's out of our grasp. So if I'm driving and I'm only having a good time driving if there is no traffic, then as soon as I hit a roadblock or any traffic of some sort, my mood, my demeanor, my everything else will completely change because I'm letting something out of my control affect how I feel. And then the last quadrant is the one that feels like it's external, that feels like it's out of our control, and it feels difficult. Now, this one can be the trickiest one because it can feel like you have the least amount of control, the least amount of influence, the least amount of impact in this space. It can actually make it feel easier to quit ahead of time, or to not give it your best, or to look for reasons to quit before you would otherwise. And that can look like me driving, focus on the fact that I still have 3/4 of the way to go, that I'm out of my iced coffee, that my back is hurting, and now I've hit traffic. And so I am miserable and not enjoying the road trip in the least, while I question whether I should just turn around and drive back home. Right? And so I hope you're starting to see how these different quadrants can fall into your own life and the different tasks that you're facing. Because what you'll notice if you pay attention is that imposter syndrome is not equal. There's certain situations or scenarios that will trigger it more for you. There's certain tasks that will feel easier and that you even forget imposter syndrome exists. And so part of the work is recognizing how much of this is based on your perspective, on your focus, on your perception of what is inside of your control versus out, and your sense of ease versus effort to completing the tasks that you're doing. But there is one more layer to this. And that, if we make this more of a 3D shape, that is where we start to add in your level of doubt versus confidence. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you feel like you technically know better, or should know better, or have the skills above someone else, and yet they just proceed without caution? They just throw everything to the wind and their confidence is somehow off the charts while you sit there questioning how they're doing the thing that you know you could be doing better, and yet they're just doing it? That's where your level of confidence versus self-doubt comes in. And I know for myself, I've found myself in that situation way more times than I'd care to admit or that I'd like to be in. When I first started showing up online for my business, I was often overthinking every single thing that I put out there. I had good intentions. I had spent so much time learning all this research and theory, and I had all the intentions to share it. But then I would question myself and I would second guess my ideas, and I would not post what I had in mind, only to scroll on social media and to see someone else who would talk about similar things to what I had in mind, and they would just be doing it with so much confidence and credibility, and people would be loving it. And I would sit there wondering, if they can do it, why can't I? And that's because your level of confidence versus self-doubt will always impact how you feel, how you think about and interpret the situation at hand, and thereby how you choose to act or react to it. And so when you understand how your perspective is at play, you then start to understand the nuance of the doubt that gets layered into it. Because if you already have this underlying sense of something being difficult and out of your control, and you have doubt layered on top of it, can you start to see how that can make you spiral and lose your cool and second guess everything that you think you know? And so the question becomes, what is causing that doubt? And how can you convert it and change it and move yourself along to get more to the confident end? Now, I think that doubt and self-doubt is incredibly nuanced, and I think it's often oversimplified in the way that we talk about it and the way that we understand it. I actually have an entire workshop I've created dissecting doubt. I believe that there are 3 main types of doubt that we all face, and that not all doubt is equal. And so considering all of the research and the theory and the work that I've done, I've really taken a step toward dissecting doubt and understanding where exactly it comes from. Because the same way that our identity or our self-concept is formed through different influences and different sources, the same exact thing happens to our doubt. Not all doubt is the same, and not all doubt comes from the same place. And so I believe that trying to react to your doubt in the same way every single time won't always work. Because if you're doubting yourself versus if you're doubting the process that you're following, those are different situations. They're different scenarios. They're bringing up different things in you that should be reacted to differently. Because whether you're reacting to doubt in yourself because of an actual deficit in your skills versus if you have a perceived sense of self-doubt because of consistent messaging that you've received, if someone has always told you to doubt a certain skill just because of their own limitations, those are different psychologically. And so treating them requires a slightly different approach as well. And so if you're interested in getting that workshop, I'll link it down below where we can go a lot deeper into being done with our doubt and dissecting it further. But essentially, when it comes to your doubt, I think it's important to recognize what exactly it is that you doubt. Just like imposter syndrome, I think so much of the advice online around doubt oversimplifies it and treats all doubt as self-doubt. And so if I feel doubt, if I feel uncertainty, it's often being linked back to myself. And so if you're feeling doubt in yourself and you're already labeling it as imposter syndrome, you're very likely taking these different things that you feel uncertain about and sort of smushing them into having uncertainty about yourself and your expertise, when there is more nuance to it. And so part of this work in overcoming your own imposter syndrome involves sitting down and really assessing what the uncertainty is about. Because odds are, not all of the uncertainty comes back to you and your lack of skills. And so when you start to recognize what it is that you feel uncertain about, when you add it into understanding your perspective, your understanding of how much easier effort it will take, your perception of how much is in your control versus in an outer influence, when you start to put these pieces together, you can start to feel empowered and get a much better sense of what is actually happening internally. Because there's nuance to this. And as you see, different tasks, different situations, different scenarios, different people, different meetings can all trigger different levels of imposter syndrome within you. And if you're taking everything and clunking it all into one label, that can start to feel extremely overwhelming. And so to get to the psychology of your imposter syndrome, you first have to get to the psychology of yourself. Because when you understand exactly what is happening, what is shaping your perspective and your understanding, even if that's your understanding of yourself, that's when you can start to dive deeper into all of this work, and you can start to unravel the threads of your imposter syndrome. You can start to show up differently in the specific situations. So for me, when I started to recognize that it was those specific meetings that were causing me to feel anxiety and uncertain, it became easier to recognize that, again, other people were having similar thoughts. Other people were on the same page as me. And even if I ask a question that doesn't go over well, it's okay. I can still overcome it. I can still phrase the question to the best of my ability. I can ask a follow-up question if I need to. There's options. It doesn't have to boil down to just being uncertain, doubting yourself, and never following through. So you can do it. You can overcome imposter syndrome, but it just starts by understanding where you currently fall in your own psychology. If this has been a fun topic and you'd like to talk about more things like this, come check out the community I'm building specifically for leaders working on their executive presence, their leadership style, and their overall confidence leading others. It's called Executive Signals, and I'll leave the link down below so you can come check it out and join us. Because topics like this can be sensitive, and having a safe space to talk about it, having a community who understands that you're going through, well, I think there's truly a lot of value in that. And so I hope you found this episode helpful. Reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions or have any requests for future episodes of this series, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.